During these historical events, it is somewhat difficult to find where Oscar's madness ends and reality begins. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Read the Right Thing Book Reviews. I'm Eric. Thanks so much for tuning in. Gunter Grass was a German novelist and artist known for his depictions of Germany in the Nazi and World War II era. Grass struggled as an artist early on until he decided to write a novel, which ended up being The Tin Drum. The Tin Drum was published in 1959 and gained immediate success in Germany. Pretty incredible to produce such a book as your first attempt at a novel. The book was also adopted into an Oscar-winning film. I'll talk a little bit about the differences between the film and the book at the end of the video. Grass was more than just a novelist. He was a painter, he sculpted, he illustrated, and also wrote poetry. Grass was known as the moral compass or moral conscience of post-war Germany. He socially critiqued and probed Germany's dark past according to a PBS article. He helped Germany escape the darkness and find a new identity with his books. However, shocking news came out in 2006 when Grass revealed that he was a member of a Nazi SS unit in World War II. He broke this news right before the release of his new memoir, and there is some speculation as to why he waited so long to reveal his past. The Tin Drum came out in 1959, and he never hinted at this until 2006. So there's some speculation and also confusion as to how his detractors and haters didn't find this out before he released it. Some speculate he did this after he'd already received the Nobel Prize in 1999, while some speculate it was just a way to maybe stir up PR for his book sales of his memoir. But I don't think the timing makes sense on either of these theories, really. I think it weighed on him heavily, and that is why he shared the information when he did. Many people called Grass a hypocrite for writing about Nazi crimes for all those years. I'm sure many fans felt sad and betrayed. Grass was just a young child during the rise of Hitler and just a teenager during World War II. I think especially in someone's formative years, it is even easier to get swept up in nefarious causes. I believe we shouldn't be so quick to judge someone by their past actions, no matter how atrocious. Just as the book depicts, normal people can quickly be swept up into committing evil acts or sitting idly on the sidelines while the acts occur. And especially these days, a lot of people like to look at the past through a present lens. There is even a term, presentism, when someone forces today's morals and ideals on people, history, and literature of the past. When in reality, I bet most people would have gone along with the herd. Herd mentality is a real thing. Just look at all the past events throughout history. I'm not defending Grass's past, and I don't even necessarily know if this is a case of presentism, because everyone would agree that those acts were atrocious. I'm just saying Grass's books and life should not be erased. We cannot know light without darkness or sweet without bitter. Unfortunately, many have been persuaded to join evil groups throughout history, but some of those people change. Grass said his past was a weight on him throughout the years. Perhaps he wrote these books as a way to not just confront Germany's past, but his own past. The Tin Drum first came onto my radar when I heard Richard Ford talk about it in an interview on YouTube. When Tin Drum was released, it enjoyed immediate success, but also sparked controversy. Many European countries, like Portugal, banned the book completely. People found the book gross, pornographic, and unnecessary. Germany was still coping and healing from World War II in 1959 when the book was published. It was difficult for the German people to reevaluate and start producing art again. Germany is a country that has produced great thinkers, scientists, artists, and musicians before and after the war, but there's always that dark spot. Most German novels about World War II are realistic depictions of war. The Tin Drum zags from this. It is a magical, fantastical novel featuring a dwarf who can shatter glass with his scream. Not exactly the most realistic narrator to tell us about the events of World War II. The novel is a war novel the same way Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five is a war novel. Sure, there are depictions of war, but the majority of the books are about people, relationships, and experiences. And both these novels are full of magical realism, or in Vonnegut's case, science fiction. Grass, like Vonnegut, revisits the past by inserting strange characters into history and merging fantasy with real events. At the time, I'm sure it was revolutionary to look at war from the eyes of a dwarf. Now we have books with children protagonists and many different types of characters recounting war. And I think that's good because war has a far reach and affects more than just the soldiers. The other book that I thought drew comparison to The Tin Drum was Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. In that book, the point of view of the terrorist attacks of September 11th is through a young child. Both protagonists from The Tin Drum and Extremely Loud share the same name and a liking of percussive instruments. Safran Foer was definitely borrowing from Gunter Grass's Tin Drum. I read Extremely Loud in college, and I remember liking it, but I remember disliking the movie. So I think now I might have to do a reread to see the comparisons between that and The Tin Drum. I even saw a title to a scholarly article about how Safran Foer cheaply imitates The Tin Drum. I guess I'll have to see for myself. The protagonist in Tin Drum is a kid named Oscar Matsuroth. At the age of 3, in an act of rejecting the adult world, he refuses to grow. Oscar says he was a clairaudient newborn and was fully formed mentally at the time of his birth. He possesses a scream that can shatter glass, which he uses as a defense mechanism. Oscar views most adults as his enemies who are trying to stop him from fulfilling what he is supposed to do, which is beat on his tin drum. Now, it's interesting, the first line of the book is, "Granted, I am a patient at a mental hospital," which means, as a narrator, Oscar is wildly imperfect and untrustworthy. And even Oscar knows this. Oscar breaks the fourth wall many times to address the reader, and he usually says, "Now, you might not believe this because I'm a mental patient, but this is what happens." Oscar is very smart, socially awkward, and also a bit of a sociopath. He's also incredibly selfish and kind of a pervert. It's not all fairy tale, magical realism in this book. There are long chapters and sections that are completely realistic. The historical context of the book is centered on true events. It just features an unreliable narrator who lived through these events. The plot is a long, spanning narrative of multiple generations and Oscar's life as a baby all the way to his 30s. The book begins with Oscar giving the story of how his grandparents met, and the sexual deviancy begins right from the beginning when his grandpa is running from the police and hides under his grandma's skirts. And then Oscar's mom, Agnes, is born. Agnes is in love with a man named Jan Bronsky, a Polish man and also her cousin. But she marries Alfred Matsuroth, who is a German and Oscar's father. As far as Oscar knows, Alfred is his father. Agnes carries on an affair with her cousin, Jan Bronsky, who is presumed as Oscar's real father, as they share the same blue eyes. Oscar wasn't able to attend school because he couldn't stop disrupting class with his drumming. He gets kicked out on the first day, so he has to go and search for a suitable teacher in his building. He settles on a woman in his building named Gretchen. She's not much of a teacher, so he takes to just grabbing books off their bookshelves. The only thing Oscar wants to read from is the nudity and orgy-filled books of Rasputin. The other author that Oscar takes a liking to is the German author Goethe. So he wasn't reading your typical children's books. Rasputin and Goethe are brought up constantly in the book. I was not too familiar with either, and I was curious why it was so prevalent. I did some outside reading, and I found that the two represent two different ideas of art. Essentially, they're the same as Dionysus and Apollo, the Greek gods. Calm, structured, and harmonious versus emotional, erratic, and disorderly. The German philosopher Nietzsche coined the term Apollonian and Dionysian. Nietzsche argued every human has these two conflicting gods in their personalities. And Oscar has these two conflicting gods as well, only instead of Apollo and Dionysus, he uses Rasputin and Goethe. If you decide to read this book, I think it would be wise to do some research on Goethe and Rasputin and Apollo and Dionysus before reading this book. It could help you to better understand and enjoy the book. But here is how Oscar describes the two. The conflicting harmony between these two was to shape or influence my whole life, at least what life I have tried to live apart from my drum. To this very day, and even now that Oscar in his eagerness for learning is gradually plowing his way through the whole hospital library, I snap my fingers at Schiller and company and fluctuate between Rasputin and Goethe, between the faith healer and the man of the Enlightenment, between the dark spirit who cast a spell on women and the luminous poet prince who was so fond of letting women cast a spell on him. If for a time I inclined more toward Rasputin and feared Goethe's intolerance, it was because of a faint suspicion that if you, Oscar, had lived and drummed at his time, Goethe would have thought you unnatural, would have condemned you as an incarnation of anti-nature, that while feeding his own precious nature, which essentially you have always admired and striven for, even when it gave itself the most unnatural airs. On honey buns, he would have taken notice of you, poor devil, only to hit you over the head with Faust or a big heavy volume of his theory of colors. Oscar claims he became a literary genius by reading Rasputin. and it was difficult for him to act foolish and maintain his childlike innocence while being so smart. Back to Oscar's mom, she really wants to be with Jan, and on a beach trip, Alfred finally crosses the line by making her eat ills after they saw how they were disgustingly caught. Agnes is fed up with Alfred Montserrat, and she commits suicide by eating fish. Oscar, now motherless, is left with Jan, Alfred, his grandma, and his neighbors. Alfred takes on a young salesgirl named Maria. The relationship between Oscar and Maria was probably my favorite part of the book. Their relationship starts off innocent as Maria is more of his babysitter and caretaker. Oscar says Maria was his first love. However, their relationship turns sexual very quickly. Now, by this time, Oscar's a 16-year-old in the body of a 3-year-old. The way Gross writes these sex scenes is very funny, to me at least. Oscar has a way of describing sexual body parts and sexual acts through symbols. I don't know what this says about me that this was my favorite part, but I just found this to be the most humorous and entertaining part. Oscar deifies Maria and says that she is a saint and that she smells like vanilla. She's perfect to him. Although Oscar soon discovers she doesn't smell like vanilla everywhere. In other areas, she smells like mushrooms. It's exactly how a person who stopped growing at 3 would describe sex parts and sex. Oscar and Maria's sexual relationship starts at the beach when she finds something called fizz powder in her bag. She pours this fizz powder in her hand and Oscar spits in it, and it basically creates like a bubbling soda type thing. And she gets off on this. Now later back at home, Oscar tries this while they're sleeping together. And they started to sleep together because it was innocent. She was just his caretaker. So he's putting this fizz powder in her hand and then he puts it in her belly button. And this is where it goes from here. I, however, was close to Maria's belly button, looking for raspberries. I sank my tongue into it and found more and more of them. I wandered far afield, came to places where there was no forester to demand a permit to pick berries. I felt under obligation to cull every last berry. There was nothing but raspberries in my eyes, my mind, my heart, my ears. All I could smell in the world was raspberries. And so intent was I upon raspberries that Oscar said to himself only in passing, "Maria is pleased with your assiduity. That's why she has turned off the light. That's why she surrenders so trustingly to sleep and allows you to go on picking. For Maria was rich in raspberries. And when I found no more, I found, as though by chance, mushrooms and other spots. And because they lay hidden deep down beneath the moss, my tongue gave up, and I grew an 11th finger. For my 10 fingers proved inadequate for the purpose. And so Oscar acquired a 3rd drumstick. He was old enough for that. And instead of drumming on 10, I drummed on the moss. I no longer knew if it was I who drummed, or if it was Maria, or if it was my moss or her moss. Do the moss and the 11th finger belong to someone else and only the mushrooms to me? Did the little gentleman down there have a mind and a will of his own? Who was doing all this? Oscar, he, or I? To me, that's just a very humorous way to describe sex. Growing an 11th finger, getting a 3rd drumstick. It's exactly how this crazy Oscar would probably tell someone what happened. Later, Oscar catches Alfred and Maria having sex on the couch, which really infuriates him and puts a wrench in their relationship. Oscar climbs on top and starts beating them, wanting to get them to stop. Now Oscar despises Maria and Alfred. Maria became pregnant and Oscar tries to kill the baby multiple times. Maria ends up giving birth to a son named Kurt, and Alfred assumes he is the father, while Oscar claims that he knows he is the father. Oscar grows up throughout this book. He takes on a few sexual partners, he sees the world, and again is maybe making all of this up because he's a mental patient at a mental hospital. I think it is pretty gutsy to write things like this. People did call this book pornographic, but the way he writes the sex scenes could have been way more pornographic had another author written it. The film also handles these sex scenes about the best way you could. It's obviously a little weird seeing this young actor do these things, but it's not overly pornographic in the film. Readers will find many symbols throughout this book. Oscar may represent Germany and the German people. However, Gross denied this claim in an interview I saw. A common occurrence with authors, they neither confirm nor deny an analysis or symbols, but would rather just let the work kind of stand alone. But I think it's undeniable that Oscar represents Germany and German people. If Oscar does represent Germany, I think it's interesting that he's a dwarf in a mental hospital. Oscar tries to maintain his innocence by not growing up, but he realizes throughout his life that he is culpable for the death of his family members. He always feigned innocence by reverting to a 3-year-old to protect himself. He is a spectator of evil acts. and even commit some evil acts himself. He witnesses many deaths, battles, a rape, and war. He grows painfully, loses his loved ones, and becomes rich and famous, only to end up a mental patient. This book takes place in Danzig, which is a city in Poland, and Oscar is neither fully Polish or fully German, but he's Kashubian. Kashubians settled in Danzig long before anyone and saw the city change hands frequently. Oscar's grandma, who's also Kashubian, said they weren't Pole enough for the Poles and they weren't German enough for the Germans. So they're kind of an outcast people. Especially during World War II, the Kashubians were stateless and outcasts. Identity is very important in this book, and many of the characters struggle to maintain a true version of themselves. Poles, Germans, and Kashubians can all coexist in this town until the Nazi ideology breaks them up. The setting of Danzig or Dansk, Poland, also represents this middle ground. Oscar doesn't just revolt against the grown-up world, but he also revolts against fascism. I didn't gather that Oscar did this on purpose, however. I think he simply wanted to disrupt as many things as he could. He was always rebelling against something, whether it was his parents, his community, Christianity, the town, anything. He would rebel against anything. At a Nazi rally, Oscar is underneath the stage, and when the band is introducing the leaders, Oscar starts to beat his drum and play a waltz. His drumming starts this chain reaction of the band playing a waltz, and everyone begins to dance. Thus, it sort of breaks up this Nazi rally. Everyone dances, including the Nazi leaders, which is a very funny scene. The drum and his childlike appearance is what Oscar uses to maintain his innocence and revolt against the adult world. However, one night at the circus, he meets a midget who was a star in the circus. This guy's name was Bebra, and Bebra counsels Oscar that their type is always supposed to be on top of the stage, not underneath it. Oscar uses his talents as a drummer and glass shatterer to join a traveling circus that entertains the Nazi soldiers. So Bebra and this circus, they entertain the Nazis. They aren't necessarily culpable for the atrocities, but they're sitting idly by and entertaining these evil people. I think they're just opportunistic to entertain the group and get to travel around Europe. It's not like they are the fascists, just the people who entertain the fascists. I think this little section could definitely represent German business and capitalism during World War II. Oscar is placed right in the middle of several key events of World War II, like Night of the Broken Glass, the First Battle of World War II, and the Siege of Danzig by the Russians. During these World War II events, Oscar is simply preoccupied with his drum. During Night of the Broken Glass, when the Nazis were destroying Jewish businesses and homes, the owner of a toy store, a Jewish man, committed suicide, and the only thing Oscar thought about was he wouldn't be able to get new drums anymore. It's interesting that Oscar's infantile act of shattering glass is the same as what the Nazis do to Jewish stores and homes. Oscar calls Hitler the gas man and compares the love that the Germans have for the gas man as the same way children love Santa Claus. You never get a clear idea. I don't even think they mention Hitler by name, but you know who he's talking about. Oscar is responsible for taking Jan Bronsky to the post office during the first attack of World War II. Oscar's actions hurt many people in his neighborhood and family, including Jan. All the while, Oscar can revert to acting like a 3-year-old to protect himself, which is what he does when him and Jan are finally taken prisoner by the German soldiers. He gives up Jan to the soldiers to be shot while he is safely taken somewhere else. During these historical events, it is somewhat difficult to find where Oscar's madness ends and reality begins. The war scenes through the eyes of Oscar are maddening, absurd, horrific, and at the same time somewhat amusing. You have battles going on and he's preoccupied with getting a drum or playing a card game. The other part of this book that I really enjoyed was Oscar rejecting religion and Christianity. His mother Agnes confesses to a priest weekly during her affair with Jan. And during one of Agnes's confessions, Oscar sneaks away and tries to get the baby Jesus statue to drum on his drum. Oscar finds that the statue of baby Jesus looks exactly like him. He has a way of describing things literally. For example, he calls Jesus the athlete on the cross. When the baby Jesus doesn't drum, he thinks Jesus is a phony. Oscar is discovered and escorted out of the church, and he encounters some opposition for the first time. The devil whispers to him, "Look at all this glass in this church you should break." But Oscar is unable to break the glass with his voice, and so begins the standoff between him and Jesus. Oscar says he's glad because the devil stayed with him through his baptism, not Jesus. And there's another part where he's talking about Catholicism. I must admit that the floors of Catholic churches, the smell of a Catholic church, in fact, everything about Catholicism still fascinates me in some inexplicable way. Just as redheaded girls fascinate me, though I should like to change the color of their hair. And that Catholicism never ceases to inspire me with blasphemies, which make it perfectly clear that I was irrevocably, though to no good purpose, baptized a Catholic. So Christianity and Jesus, they serve no purpose for Oscar. But an interesting moment is when Oscar leaves the circus to return to Danzig for Kurt's third birthday. When Oscar returns, he finds himself in the church and he tries his little drumming experiment with the baby Jesus statue one more time. Only this time, the Jesus statue drums, and it asks Oscar to be his disciple. Oscar, of course, doesn't want to do this even after witnessing this miracle. He's too hard-headed. Later, a gang of young men called the Dusters, they have Oscar cornered one day. Oscar tells the gang that his name is Jesus. The Dusters just think this is kind of bullshit, and they're about to hurt him when all the sirens across the town go off, validating his claim to the Dusters. And especially after he breaks glass with his scream, the Dusters follow him, and Oscar has his own disciples. The Dusters go about raising hell and start stealing things from churches. They are caught one night, and Oscar and the Dusters are put on trial, which Oscar calls the second trial of Jesus. So Oscar thinks of himself as a Jesus figure. The final event that we see in World War II is when the Russians invade Oscar's town of Danzig. Alfred hides his Nazi pin so he won't be caught, and somehow Oscar ends up with this. Oscar gives it back to Alfred with the sharp point of the pin exposed. Alfred is obviously terrified of being exposed as a Nazi, so he swallows it, but he ends up choking on the sharp pin. They all witness this, and a Russian soldier unloads a lot of bullets just to put Alfred out of his misery. And again, from the perspective of Oscar, he really notices these strange things, like a trail of ants just diverting their path around Alfred. This man just died, and the life of the ants is just unchanged. They just start a new course. Oscar believes he is partially, if not totally, to blame for the killing of his three parent figures. He's refused to grow at this point. Now he's free of these parental figures and adult expectations. At Alfred's funeral, he wrestles with the question of should he or shouldn't he grow. He comes to a conclusion, he tosses his drum into the grave with Alfred, and then he starts to grow. He grows quickly and painfully, and his growth symbolizes he is taking responsibility for his action or his inactions. He grows disfigured and with a hump. After the funeral, Oscar goes to Germany with Maria and Kurt, where a completely new story unfolds. He works as a stonecutter at a graveyard, becomes famous in a jazz band where he works at a club where patrons cut onions to cry, and eventually ends up in the mental hospital. Drumming transformed from just a fun, childish act to a way he fought fascism, to a way for Oscar to gain fame and money. Oscar Matzerath is one of the more interesting, maddening protagonists I've come across. I enjoyed this story very much, but overall, would I say this is the right thing for me? I don't know if I would go that far. It wasn't the right thing for me right now. A 600-page novel is always a daunting task. During and after, I thought about this book a lot, which was good. When you spend so much time with a book, you want its ideas and its theme to really permeate and stick in your mind. So some of the dislikes of this book were it's a very long read. And it's not just long, but it's maddening. At a lot of different points, I felt the narrative dragging, but just when I was ready to maybe punt on it, something incredibly funny, sad, or exciting happened, and I decided to keep reading. It's an epic, mythic story at just under 600 pages. I found a lot of the early chapters repetitive and boring. I liked Gross's writing style, and I thought it was funny, but I was wondering where it was going a lot of the times, especially at the beginning. I'm also not very familiar with all of the things that Gross alludes to, like I said, Gunter, Rasputin, and other Germanic fairy tales. This book's definitely not for everyone. A lot of the comments online that I read, people just hate the book and they don't really understand what makes it so great. I can understand and appreciate its greatness, but I don't think I'll be racing to the bookstores to pick up another Gunter Grass book anytime soon. I think I would rather read his memoir than one of his other novels. He sounds like an interesting guy, but maybe later in life I'll revisit this one or another one of his novels. When I reread certain sections for this review, I really did enjoy his writing style. Now, a little bit about the movie. The film was on HBO Max after I finished the book. I'm not sure if it's still on there. So after I finished the book, I watched the movie. And I think I like the film more than the book. The film could have easily been 3+ hours with how long the book is, but it's just a little over 2. The entire section after Oscar, Maria, and Kurt get to Germany is left out. The movie ends with Oscar, Maria, and Kurt boarding the train. I think the film takes the best scenes from the book and adapts those really well, especially the Nazi rally that Oscar breaks up. That was a very good scene, very funny. Hearing the music and seeing the dancing really added a lot to that scene. And of course, the relationship between Maria and Oscar was just as strange in the movie as in the book. Their relationship isn't quite as explicit in the film, of course, so they kind of toned it back, but you still get the weirdness and this weird relationship. It's a beautiful film that takes the best scenes from the book. If you're interested in the story but don't want to take on a daunting 600-page novel, the film would definitely be the right thing for you. So there it is, that's my review. If you like political satire and magical realism that is sexual, gross, funny, sad, and violent, then you might like this. If you're looking for a World War II book with a strange narrator, and if you enjoy German culture and fairy tales, then this is definitely for you. The Tin Drum really captures the feelings and despair of war and post-war Germany. So that was my review of Gunter Grass's The Tin Drum. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found something helpful. It really is a massive book, so I couldn't talk about everything. If you've read this book, let me know what you thought about it in the comments, if I missed anything or if you had a favorite part. As always, thanks for tuning in, and make sure you read the right thing. As always, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching. Well, thanks for watching, and as always, read the right thing. Thanks for watching this review. If you've read this book, let me know what you thought about it in the comments. And as always, read the right thing. As always, keep on reading the right thing. As always, keep on reading the right thing.